in the power generation industry now, there's sort of a move back towards thinking, well, you know, just like people have central heat and central air, maybe they need central power, and distributed grid systems would make more sense. I think what you'll find is over time, what Tim is discussing, while it takes a while to sort of wrap your head around it, water is a constant. Where do you think it's going, and where do you think it come from? We already do this. Why not have a distributed system so that you had your own water supply?
Well, it sounds like the system that you're describing is really just sort of taking the lake out of the equation in many ways. You know, the water's not going back to the lake and then, you know, or being treated going back to the lake and then coming back. But it doesn't sound, I mean, that sounds like a, you know, a personal water treatment system, but doesn't address the things that you just mentioned in terms of stormwater runoff or mercury from coal-fired power plants. So any of that pollution is still going to be an issue, even if we were to conserve using methods like Senator Grendell just described. So I know there's also some technology here going on in Ohio in terms of arsenic and mercury mitigation as well. Can you talk about that?
Well, we have a startup company. What's interesting, again, to go back to what Tim was saying, industry created this problem. And some industries are now beginning to recognize they can help solve this problem. Most of the water technologies that are being deployed today have come out of the minerals and mining field. And the minerals and mining is one of the major polluters in the first place. But we have a company here in the region, a startup company that's been funded by Jumpstart, that's a spin-off from a regional company called Metalloy. And that company is called Mars Systems. And they are focused specifically on removing mercury and arsenic from water. And it's a very embryonic company. But these are critical issues. Mercury is just an unbelievable toxin. And so long as we rely on coal power for generating electricity, we are going to have serious issues with mercury in our water. And so while on the one hand I want to see us moving away from coal, we are still going to have to deal with the residue of it. And so having companies like Mars System being able to, again, we have the nearshore contamination and can be the test bed for this technology, which then that technology becomes exportable to other places in the world that have similar problems.
Senator Grendell?
I prefer to use the word user and disturber than polluter when I think about mineral companies and mining companies in our state. They employ a lot of people and they do create a lot of economic opportunity. I think, though, they, as with everything, maybe did not use the most prudent practices in the past, and they need to look at better technology practices. I think the state can help that in some respects. I think we can help provide tax incentives to industry to try to be more prudent in the way they deal with the discharge of water, the disturbance of water. But we have to remember, as long as we're going to have certain jobs, as long as we're going to turn on an electric switch today on our property, you're going to need coal. You're going to need disturbance in mining operations because that's necessary for us to turn these lights on in most places in Ohio and to make the steel that in those cars that employ a lot of Ohioans. So I think we got to keep this balance of not wanting to over-cost our industry and continue to discourage them from staying in the state of Ohio while we're looking at preserving our environmental assets. And I think that's where the state needs to take a little better look at creative tax incentive management, advances in helping with industry, finding better ways of dealing with the discharge of water that's been handled in the manufacturing, industrial, mining areas. And there is some other new technology on the horizon. The largest user of water in Ohio every day is power companies. They're about 78% of the users. And that's not going to change anytime soon, but there's some interesting technology. One of the big users of water is a nuclear power plant. There are some folks who are working on a nuclear power plant that will function on far less water use than the plants that were built 30 years ago. So the state needs to help encourage that kind of development of prudent uses of the water and better uses of treating the water. But we're not going to get away from disturbing the water. That's going to continue.
No, I agree with you completely on that. I think we need to, so long as we're taking a systems approach, and that's what hasn't been there in the past, is that we haven't looked at that as a system and what the system-wide impacts are. And as a result, I think that'll lead to much more pragmatic regulations and rules and less ideologic regulations and rules. because oftentimes the law of unintended consequences will come into play. After the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts were passed, steel mills were required to their discharge water had to meet certain certification. And they found that they weren't able to do it. They couldn't get the water as clean as it needed to be. So what they did was they devised practices for making steel that used less water. Well, so the end result was still good. Still worked out well. To your point, yeah, whether a more benign word, I think, is good. Users and disturbers of water. It's a constant. We're moving it around. We have to be sensitive to how we move it around and make sure that we move it in such a way that we can reclaim it. The fact that Great Lakes Brewery came up as the first thing when you Google Great Lakes, my heart jumped because I thought, wow, that's cool. I like that. But that's an export product. That's a product that the reason it shows up, number one, is because there's 66 gallons of water going into every 12-ounce bottle that's going out all over the country, outside the basin. So we just need to be aware of that and then look at, okay, so what practices are we going to put in place to bring water back in or to manage the water that's here? When we get with stormwater runoff, that's another one.
Well, I guess then you could also argue that we're essentially stealing water from Boston if we drink Sam Adams.
Yes.
Can I just mention that in the Grendell household, we like Dortmunder Gold from Great Lakes Brewery, and when we get this new recyclable system, we'll keep it all on the Grendell property.
One of the things with stormwater runoff from that I found fascinating, the Cuyahoga River is actually in much, much better shape than it's ever been. And major improvements have been made. The point source pollution, the steel mills dumping water in, are not the real problem right now. It's non-point source pollution, which means runoff from other places. You're not really quite sure where it's coming from necessarily, but it works its way through and eventually gets into the system. Maybe it comes down in the rain, maybe it runs off from the highways, what have you. So if you take a systems approach and you look at, okay, well, what kinds of uses do we need in order to have the life that we want and to have the jobs that we want? How do we shape policies that then are sensitive to what we need to do in terms of preserving the water? Big box developers and mall developers and shopping outlets don't actually consume a lot of water. But when you put down that pavement, you stop the water from being able to get back into the ground. And so what happens to it? Runs into the street, gets oil in it, gets all sorts of other stuff in it, runs down into the storm sewers. We get large rainstorms, and it just gets dumped out with sewage into the lake. There have been some proposals and some pilot programs done where maybe we need to turn some things on its head. It's not a question of saying to someone, we're going to charge you more for water because of the way you use water. But in some circumstances, we might want to say, you know what? You can have all the water you want for free. But we're going to charge the ever-living daylights out of you for what runs off your property.
Okay. How would that be measured? And what do you think about that, Senator Grendell?
I don't know of anything that's for free in this world. Somebody pays for everything. If you said you're going to get charged for the water that runs off your property, which I think probably goes to Lake Erie and gets recycled somewhere in this basin, because unless it goes to New York, but then more water comes from Canada. But I have a problem with this idea of free, because if I'm charging you for the water that runs off your property, but giving you water for free, somebody's paying for that water, because it didn't pump to your property by magic. It had to be pulled out of the lake, it had to be treated, it had to be pumped. And so either the other people on that water system are paying for it, or the public's paying for it. And so I'm not sure I accept the concept of free. I certainly think the area of stormwater management, and full disclosure, I'm a little developer lawyer in my past life, so I have some understanding of this, is, you know, there was a time where we didn't deal with stormwater at all. The first inclination of the problem of that was flooding, because the people downstream started paying the price of not having prudent management. But we've come a long way with retention and detention, I think, and at least making inroads in stormwater management. I think I've seen 3 500-year floods now in the last 10 years, and so I'm not quite sure about the engineering science to it. But I do think if we're going to have an advanced society that builds things, there's going to be a certain amount of water that's going to run off that property. And as long as it's properly channeled and it ends up you know, in Lake Erie or wherever its natural water course goes, I'm not offended by that.